he wasn't supposed to have been in F1. Because of his contract with GP2 with Dams, where he finished quite well, there wasn't actually the funding to move on for another season of GP2, or of what is otherwise known as F2. So that's when he was moved over to a works drive with Nissan for Formula E. What was I on about just then? They are the drivers who made their Formula 1 debut for Toro Rosso, Williams and McLaren respectively, Alex Albon, George Russell and Lando Norris. The reason I've got a soft spot for them is because I've seen them go from budding karters to fully fledged professional racing drivers. Here's my side of the story. While I was having my worst season in 2006, George was starting his journey in WTP Cadets and Alex was competing in the Super 1 National Championships in both Honda and Coma Cadet. He would become champion in the former and in doing so becoming the inaugural Honda Cadet Super 1 champion. He also won the Coma Cadet Kart Masters Grand Prix, meaning he could hold on to the GP plate until the next equivalent meeting or the following year, whichever came first. Kart Masters Grand Prix always held on the first weekend of August at PF International. It's one of the staple events in UK karting. 2007 saw George stay in WTB Cadet and go on to compete in their championship. The first time I saw him was at the September Wilton Mill Club event, which was when their championship came to the circuit, and he would also win the title later on in the year. He would move to Coma Cadet for 2008. Alex did Coma Cadet only and showed well. He was 4th in the MSA Championship, or Stars of Tomorrow, whichever one you want to call it, and he was 2nd in Super 1, the latter being 5 points away from the championship. The former I am unable to verify points as the archives don't go that far back. He also had a 3rd place in the Honda O-Plate. O-Plate meaning open plate, which works on the same principle as Kartmasters GP. He would make the move into KF3 in 2008. 2008 would see Lando enter the karting scene after trying multiple hobbies such as quad biking, equestrian and motorbikes. He settled on karting when his father took him to the National Karting Championship round the previous season. He would join George in the Coma Cadet, both embarking on their first season in the class. It was a learning experience for both, and George wouldn't be seeded. The success of the season for him was winning the Kart Masters in the WTP class, which was one of his last races in WTP. Lando was mainly focused on club level in order to gain the necessary experience to get a National A license, which means you could do national championship rounds. When you start out in karting, you get a National B license, which indicates you're a novice, and I think you have to do about 15 meetings on that license before you can upgrade to a National A license, which enables you to enter Super 1 or equivalent championships. Alex had a good year in KF3. He won the Kart Masters, while he finished 2nd in the MSA series, and he was 3rd at Super 1. A good season, by all things. 2009 would be the first year that we would see all 3 drivers competing in the same championships. All 3 of them would do the newly formed Formula Kart Stars, which is the successor of Stars of Tomorrow, and they will also do the Super 1 National Championships. Formula Kart Stars is the 3rd iteration of Champions of the Future, which will later become Stars of Tomorrow, while keeping the same format. To a point. One round on Saturday was standard qualifying into heats for the cadets because of the entry list, while the rest of the classes which were Minimax, Junior Rotex, KF3 and for the first round only, KF2. They would have a qualifying session followed by a pre-final into a grand final. The grid for the pre-final would be set by the qualifying times and the grid for the grand final would be based on the results of the pre-final. Sunday would be qualifying and finals for all 5 classes. The Formula Kart Stars event started out at Kimbolton, which is appropriate because the very first round of Champions of the Future was also at Kimbolton, Hunt's Kart Racing Club based in Cambridgeshire. Saturday was a wet day all day, not helpful for anybody. George won the Coma Cadet, Alex won KF3, while Lando missed out on the A final by 2 places. To explain that, whenever there is a large grid, say more than 34 drivers, the grid positions for the final would be decided on the amount of points won in the heats. And if there are more than the full grid's worth of drivers, i.e. 34, then there would be a B final, or in the rare cases such as this one, a C final. Either way, the top 4 finishers from the C final would progress to the B final, and the top 4 drivers of the B final would progress into the main final, or otherwise known as the A final. Whenever you progress to a final, you always start on the last 4 positions of the next final. It would be dependent on where you finished. Sunday was qualifying into finals for all classes as aforementioned. It was cold, but fortunately for me as a marshal, it didn't rain. It was dry throughout. It did have a wet start, but the finals would be dry. Both George and Lando had bad qualifying sessions, meaning they would be stuck in the C final. They comfortably got through first and second, which meant they progressed to the B final, but they would be starting 31st and 32nd because of their finishing positions. Lando would go on a tear and he would win the B final, while George's meeting was over because he could only manage 6th. Sadly, Lando broke down on the rolling up lap of the A final, which was a shame, but his talent was undeniable. It just needed to be nurtured. Alex, who had won KF3 on Saturday, would end up finishing 3rd after a close 6-way battle for the lead on Sunday. The next time I saw Lando and George was a couple of weeks later at the Wilton Mill Club event. The details are a little bit vague. Neither featured in the lead battle in the final. George would win the final at the same circuit 3 months later. The separate paths that the two took, along with me, meant that the next event I would see them in action would be the November PF5 event, as the TKMGP plate was being held that weekend. An event I'd rather forget in a hurry, to be honest, but more on that later. George by this point had won the Formula Car Stars title, Kart Masters and Open Championships. He was 2nd in Super 1. After the championships had finished, he moved over to Minimax to prepare for 2010, which is the following year, and he would be remaining in Minimax. 2 Kimbolton meetings along with the aforementioned November PFI meeting, and 1 Wilton followed up, and he was up to speed already. Alex would win everything except the International Series, so both Formula Car Stars, Super 1, along with the KF3 Winter Series. Lando would be seeded for Super 1 in 2010 and his time would come. Alex will leave the picture at this point for the domestic series as he went on to race Europe. The first time I saw George race in 2010 was also the first time I was out racing, and that was the Wilton Mill Club event in February. Not the best event for George, that was mainly down to interchangeable conditions, which could have made a meal out of anybody, it was that bad. The final that day was won by Jack Aiken, another name for the future, so keep that noted. 2 months later, same track, that was the next time that we were both competing. George had a better time, even though he was only 4th, and Jack once more won the final. Those would be the only 2 events that we did at the same time. Lando didn't compete in a single event I did because of scheduling, and Alex, I've already mentioned, was in Europe. He would win the KF3 World Cup and the European Championship. George won everything that he could win in Minimax. The only one he didn't win was the Open Play, and that was only because he didn't enter it. So, what I mean by that is that he won the Super 1, Formula Car Stars, and Kart Masters Grand Prix. So he won everything that was available except for that Open Play. He would then move up to KF3 for 2011, with a little bit of help from Alex. Lando was 3rd in Super 1 and 10th in Formula Car Stars, so progress was being made on that front. This is where a future chapter and this one will converge, so I'll keep it brief and I will keep it relevant to the trio. George had a character building year in the domestic series of KF3, yet he performed better in Europe. 7th in Super 1 was a bit of a lonely par considering what happened the previous year where he won everything. While in Europe, he performed better. He won the title. When I say that he had a little help from Alex, Alex was part of the Intrepid Young Drivers program at the time, and George was able to get into the program on recommendation from Alex. It also helped that his brother was the agent, the UK agent of Intrepid Cars, so he always had a chassis ready for him. Hey, you gotta have your connections. Connections and friends, the right friends, they go hand in hand. Use them. Back to Lando, he had a strong start to his campaign, but ultimately only ended up 6th in Super 1 and 5th in Formula Car Stars. He would move on to Minimax after the final MSA Super 1 round at Wilton Mill to do the final round of the Rotex Super 1 series in Minimax at Three Sisters, Manchester Wigan. He showed well, which put in good stead for 2012. 2012 was the last time I saw them racing and karting. Lando won Formula Car Stars and was 2nd in Super 1 in his only season in Minimax. He did do Junior Max as well, but the results are a little hazy. George was 2nd in Super 1 in KF3 and retained his European title. Alex has no mention at this point as he moved to Formula Renault in 2012. The talent had been proven for the three with varying degrees of success and mishaps, but overall they stood a good chance of moving forward in their careers. Considering where we are now in 2025 and all three drivers are in Formula 1, that chance was worth it. You know, the scary thing was that Alex almost never made it to Formula 1. He was removed from the Red Bull Junior program at the end of 2012 after a bad season of Formula Renault, and he only got back in because Red Bull needed him. Alex was about to race in Formula E with Nissan and Edams, but he wouldn't take part in testing because the call up to Toro Rosso came while he was about to test for Nissan at Valencia. The catalyst behind this, it was what happened in Baku the previous year where Daniel Ricciardo decided enough was enough and started his move to Renault. This was after he ran into the back of Max Verstappen when Max, well, he did too many defensive moves. We'll get onto that in another chapter. But either way, Daniel had enough and started his move to Renault. George Russell had to sell himself in a business sense to get into the Mercedes driver program, which allowed him to continue his path to Formula 1. He ran out of funding in F3, so he was left with virtually nothing. It was only when he got into the Mercedes Young Driver program that his career was able to continue. His famous PowerPoint presentation got him the Williams drive, and when he left 3 years later, he recommended Alex, the same Alex that recommended him into the Intrepid driver program 10 years earlier as his replacement. You got to repay the favour. You got to know your contacts. And he certainly used them well. Lando, on the other hand, went a completely different route. He started out in the Ginetta Juliet, which was part of the British Touring Car Championship program, before arriving on the single-seater path, which was round about where Euro F3 was, I believe it was. He did his season in GP2. I'm not entirely certain whether he did F3 or GP3, one of the two. I'm not entirely certain on that. He was picked up by McLaren. A fresh start was needed for 2019, which is when Lando got the drive alongside Carlos Sainz Jr. And that has progressed even further to where we are now. Alex, meanwhile, as I already mentioned, he wasn't supposed to have been in F1. Because of his contract with GP2 with Dams, where he finished quite well, there wasn't actually the funding to move on for another season of GP2 or of what is otherwise known as F2, so that's when he was moved over to a works drive with Nissan for Formula E. And like I said, he was about to test at Valencia when the call from Red Bull to get him to drive for Toro Rosso came through. He was released from his contract at Nissan and Dams in order to fulfill his contract with Toro Rosso. It's a bit of a strange one. His season at GP3, where he was third behind Charles Leclerc in 2016, put him back on the map. In terms of careers before F1, I think George had the most success and really only had 1 year where it didn't go his way, and that was in 2011. Alex, he had the most character building one when he got dropped by the Red Bull program in 2012 and had to fight his way back up to respectability, get the results and get himself to Formula 1. Lando was only beginning to find his feet when he moved out of cadets and into Minimax. He had a bit more of a successful time when he moved out of karts. And then he managed to get the call up to McLaren towards the end of 2018 when a fresh change was needed, where Zach Brown was the CEO. And look how well that turned out, eh? Who's the best driver out of the three? That is a good question. I'd still say George, then Lando and Alex are quite close to each other, but neither are ahead of the other, if you see what I'm saying. Now you see why I've got a soft spot for them. I still call them out when they mess up. Where George ran into Mick at Singapore and he was trying to blame Mick, I was like, no, that was you. You went into Mick. You're not fighting for a career here. Mick is. Take some responsibility. The other time, Lando, Canada 2025, where he tried that silly move on Oscar trying to put his car in a place where the door was always going to shut on him. But credit to Lando, who took responsibility for it. Alex, you know what? I don't actually have an example of me calling him out. Nothing that springs to mind. Funny that. If you blindly follow and defend them without a justifiable reason, though, you do become blinded by what happens around them. You won't be able to think objectively, which is a lot of today's fandom falls under. They can't think objectively. But I'll be going on a tangent on that part, and that part is actually covered in another chapter. So keep it relevant. So all three drivers are in Formula 1 now. George at Mercedes, Lando at McLaren, and Alex at Williams. Alex did have that gap year in 2021 when he was dropped by Red Bull, but he spent that year in DTM, keeping himself fresh. Oh, who was in DTM? Liam Lawson. A name that would also be on the Formula 1 grid in 2025, and his story is a little bit different, but it's not relevant to the trio. Be that as it may. So you now see why I have a soft spot for the 2019 trio, Alex, George and Lando. Starting out in 2006 and seeing them progressing through the ladder all the way to Formula 1. That same year I was having a disaster of a karting season, and changes had to be made in order for me to be able to have any sort of chance of succeeding. But I won't be saying any more, otherwise I'll be spoiling the next chapter.